This is the Church of St. Paul in the Desert.
May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. This is one of those passages, and I don't think we get very many of them. It's one of those in which Jesus doesn't look very good. Jesus' interaction with this woman seems to be one that's pretty humiliating for her. I don't think there's any particular shaming on his part, but for the most part, preachers wrestle with this, and if we want Jesus to look better, we kind of have to insert some things. Like we have to make what he says ironic or something like that, but that's not in the text. In this case, we have Jesus who has gone from walking on the sea in our last reading to this area north and west of Galilee. And he's preaching and he's doing all of his things. And this woman comes shouting. And the text, and I'm using the translation from Mark Davis from Left Behind and Loving It, the woman was squawking after him. And I'm using it because the language is actually even more demeaning than what we're usually reading in English. Have you ever been someplace where you were engaged in some activity and there was somebody who was squawking? Last Sunday night, there was a gathering at Francis Stevens Park, and it was a gathering to stand against hate, stand against the white supremacists from Charlottesville, and the group was just about ready to get started. The activity was just getting ready to get started, and a fellow walked up, and he was squawking. Now, he wasn't literally squawking, but he began just shouting. Now, he was not a counter-protester. He was not against everybody who was there. I'm not sure he even knew why anybody was there. But he saw a group of people, and so he began shouting. And it really was kind of like squawking. And went on, and I was noticing people. There were approximately 8 police officers there, and I noticed some people kind of motioning to the police that they would get him out of the way. And I even saw myself kind of moving into this mode of trying to fix things or make the situation work better, even though I was simply there. I was not an organizer of the event. And then somebody said something, and he jumped down into the fountain and kept squawking. And I'm still not 100% sure what it was that he was talking about. And then he got out of the fountain and went on his way. All of about a minute and a half. But it's one of those things that's really disconcerting, especially if you're like the disciples who are kind of managing Jesus' time and everything, and they think that he needs them to provide a barrier or gatekeepers for everybody else. Somebody coming up and shouting after Jesus, squawking at him. They said, "Send her away. She's continuing to follow us and shout." And I imagine underneath they're saying, nobody's going to listen to you with her shouting like this. Now, Jesus does not answer her, and he also doesn't send her away. But he says to his disciples, "I was only called to the children of the house of Israel. I was only called to the children, the descendants of Jacob." And the woman sees that as her opportunity. And she says, "But Lord," and he says, I can't, she asks for help. And Jesus says, "It's not right to throw the children's food to the dogs." And it actually says the children's food to little dogs or puppies. It's not right to take the children's food and give it to the children of dogs. And she sees her opportunity and she says, yes, Lord, but even the puppies eat from the children's scraps. And Jesus then says, my gosh, your faith is awesome. Whatever you want, it'll be done for you. And her daughter is healed. I think that this is an example of ways that we might think about lots of things that are happening today. I've used language that was especially humiliating. It would not surprise me at all if some women here or other people who perhaps have not always been part of the mainstream have not spoken out in places and either been unanswered, been silenced, or been interrupted in the midst of what they had to say. I've even found that, probably more than I'd like to admit, that I've been guilty of mansplaining, or I guess in my case, priest-splaining to folks. And what that means is that somebody begins to talk, and instead of actually listening to what they have to say and valuing their saying it before I come up with a response, I'm already beginning a response based on what I think I know they're going to say, and assuming that, of course, I will know better about it than they do. And I've actually been caught in some of those when somebody said to me, that wasn't the point at all. But I've been just laying it all out. Well, this woman has a point. And the point is one that we might be more aware of if we thought kind of in the larger context of this gospel. This gospel follows Jesus as he's walked across the Sea of Galilee. And the week before that, you all missed. Because the week before that was Trinity Sunday, so we didn't read the lesson immediately before. And do you know what that lesson was? The feeding of the 5,000. Now I understand last week, while people had puzzled looks when I mentioned the feeding of the 5,000 as if everybody should remember it, we skipped it because of transfiguration. And so Jesus and his disciples, Jesus was teaching, and it was late, and his disciples wanted to send everybody away. And Jesus said, no, you feed them. And with 5 loaves and 2 fish, they fed 5,000 men plus unnumbered women and children. And the real key to this is when they were all done, do you know how much they had left? 12 baskets. So when this woman hears Jesus speaking from a place where he's saying, I was called to these people. The message that God has given me is for these people. She's listening to it, and she's aware of this feeding, this miraculous feeding, and she's even more aware that there was far more in abundance than the number of people who needed to be fed. One of the few times it seems like Jesus is operating out of a mentality of scarcity, the woman reminds him of God's abundance. The message from that feeding of the 5,000 is that in God's providence, there's plenty for everybody and to spare. Jesus doesn't need to be concerned about not fulfilling what God has asked Jesus to do for the children of the house of Israel. There's enough of God's blessing and God's love and God's grace for children of Jacob and children of the Canaanites as well. Now, in my mind, this is a change away from the ways that we often do things. We often see things as polarized, right and wrong, black and white, yes and no, and there's only room for 2 positions. And if anybody listens to you, then they automatically disagree with me. Well, I think the woman was really doing something different. The woman was inviting Jesus to remember back on his own teaching, his own acts of power, to remember that there is no scarcity in God's kingdom, but there is abundance for all. What I would love to see is us as a people move away from a place where we feel the need to condemn anybody who disagrees with our particular position, and rather see the disagreements as an opportunity to learn more about one another and bring one another more fully into the story that we all share in common. Now that's tough. It doesn't really make for good sound bites. It's not the kind of thing that you can wrap up in just a few seconds. It's the thing that encourages people to meet and get together, and it means that the person that I'm talking to may actually have to listen to something beyond their own position. And listen not to find out, to make a judgment about whether or not I'm right, but to listen to find out who I am. And the idea that I would invite for all of us is to engage on issues in a way that's beyond just yes or no, right or wrong. I'm not going to try to cover everything that's happened in the country and in the world in the last week or so this week. But I think you get the idea that if we look to listen beyond the yeses and the nos and figure out ways to find the person beneath whatever the position is, we might grow and we might participate more effectively in God's abundance. And now I have a kind of an object lesson to finish with. And it's about how to be successful and wealthy in America. And some of you may have seen it on the internet. I was given it by a friend, and I posted it on my Facebook page. And last I looked, 5 people had seen it. Is that trending? No, 5 people is not trending. And it is a teacher in a classroom, and it's a high school classroom, and there's 5 rows of students, and the class has finished for the day. They finished whatever the assignment was. He says, before you leave, I've got a game I want to play with you. And so he passed out a sheet of paper to everybody in the room. And he says, so you all got a sheet of paper? He says, now I want you to crumble that sheet of paper up. And we're going to play a game to see how you get to be successful and wealthy in America. And he put a trash can right down in front of his desk. He said, I want you all to throw, and you're going to be successful and wealthy if you get your paper in the basket. So they all threw. And of course the camera is seeing where everybody goes, and most everybody's missing the basket like crazy. But amazingly, the people in the front just about dunked it. He says, okay, I hear what you're saying. Those of you in the back row, you're telling me that it wasn't fair. He says, and it's noticeable that only the people in the back row are saying it's not fair. And nobody in the front row was talking about how unfair this was. Because the people in the back row had so far to throw, they couldn't even see the basket. But the people in the front row, all they had between them and the basket was 5 feet of air. He says, and they didn't even pick where they were going to be. They just kind of happened to be in those places. He said, that's kind of how it is. That there are people who are successful because they ended up in the front row. And there are people who are struggling because they ended up in the back row. Not because they deserved to be in the back row, they just ended up there. He says that also means that there's nothing wrong with being in the front row. But if you're somebody who had that advantage and had that clean shot, you also have a responsibility. If you had the advantage of that good education, you have the responsibility to use it for the benefit of the community and the benefit of others. And you have the responsibility to be aware that there are people in the rows behind you that couldn't even see the basket. And you have to pay attention and advocate for them. To me, this sounds an awful lot like things that we've heard from Jesus. And the idea is that those of us, somebody brought it up to me after the service, those to whom much is given, much will be required. So if we began to accept that each of us has parts of our life that we've really worked hard to accomplish, and we have parts of our life that actually just happened. And we're just the undeserving, potentially, beneficiaries of them. And when we take advantage of them and use them, that's okay. But we need to pay attention to others. We need to advocate for people who didn't have the same advantage. And we need to use the gifts that we've been given as stewards of God's love, as stewards of God's grace, to make sure that children of Jacob and children of the Canaanites all participate in the amazing abundance of God's grace. Amen.